Welcome to the study of end times, where we will be investigating all the biggest issues surrounding eschatology. My name is Adam Jordan Clark, and I will be guiding you through this long journey of uncovering the truth of what we call the end times. This study will include topics like the writing and dating of the book of Revelation, early-late date debate, the destruction of Jerusalem that occurred in 70 AD, the rapture, the end times, the second coming of Christ, Jewish and Christian apocalyptic literature, early churches, early Christians, Flavian and Josephus, Jesus' apocalyptic message, the New Testament's apocalyptic message, and one of the most important things we could ever talk about, the meaning of the kingdom of God. Join me as we dive deep into the study of eschatology. Okay, so here is a little picture of the Mount of Olives. It's a map, okay? And here's Jerusalem, and right next to it is Mount of Olives. On a map, this doesn't look very far, and I would probably say it's maybe a mile away, maybe 2 miles away. Not entirely sure. So I'm not really sure how long it took for Jesus and his disciples to leave Jerusalem and get to the Mount of Olives. And I don't think anybody else is either. We can have some good guesstimations out there, but of course we have no way of knowing. So what I'm talking about is when you read the Olivet Discourse, which is Mark 13, Matthew 24, and Luke 21, when you read that, it says that Jesus was in Jerusalem. He had just left Jerusalem, and he went up to the Mount of Olives to deliver the Olivet Discourse. And that distance was probably about a mile. Now, how long it took for him to get there is a completely different matter. We don't really know, simply because we don't know how the roads were. We don't know what route they took. We don't know if there were markets around, how many people were there, whether it was a time of day where the city was really busy, maybe there wasn't a lot of people in the city. Who knows? It could have took him 20 minutes to get there, could have took him an hour to get there, could have took him 3 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours. It could have been an all-day thing. Don't really know, but what we do know is that the New Testament tells us, the gospel accounts tell us, that they were in Jerusalem and they left Jerusalem and they went to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus is overlooking the mount. He's standing up on the Mount of Olives and he's looking at Jerusalem. He's looking down at Jerusalem because the Mount of Olives is a little ridge. It's a mount. It's a little ridge that's just above Jerusalem. It's still there today, but now it's a cemetery. I will show you a picture of that in just a second. But it's a little ridge, and so Jesus goes up to this ridge and he's looking down at the city and he delivers the Olivet Discourse. And what you have to understand about the Mount of Olives is that the Mount of Olives is not a random place. And really what you have to understand about apocalypticism is that there is no insignificant terms, no insignificant images with apocalypticism. In other words, it all goes together, and it all has meaning and significance. Most of the time, it's because it's already happened. So the Mount of Olives, if you're very familiar with the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, you'll know that the Mount of Olives is not a random place. To a new reader of the New Testament or the Bible or a new student of the Bible, you think, oh, wow, the Mount of Olives, that's just some random place. Well, it's not just some random place. It's a very significant place. Jews know very much about the Mount of Olives. It's a very special place, and so Jesus goes to this very special place, which kind of, should raise an eyebrow. Jesus goes out of his way to the special place to deliver the Olivet Discourse. On one hand, that gives a good rise to believe that this is a prophetic moment, that it's really ordained by God, that it's divine intervention. On the other hand, it raises the eyebrow and gives good reason to an argument to say that this is completely bogus, that it never happened, and this is pure propaganda. So you have two ways of looking at it, okay? And that's one of the problems with eschatology, and particularly apocalypticism, which is why you have to be very delicate, because you have one extreme to another extreme, and a lot of times the evidence goes together. The evidence I use for this argument can also be used for that argument. So you have to be very careful. When people come out and say, oh, this is fact and that's fact, you need to be very careful with those people because, it's not relative, but it's almost like it is relative. That's not the best way to explain it, but what is the best way to understand it is to simply say that the fact that I use this for this argument does not mean that it's not good for that argument. In other words, we can use the same facts to argue against each other. So that's very important to understand. But this article, by the way, is something that you should read. You should look over if you want to understand some stuff about the Mount of Olives, which I highly recommend that you do. If you really want to understand Jesus and the Olivet Discourse and pretty much eschatology in general, you want to understand the end times, the second coming of Christ, the rapture, or whatever, you should really understand what's happening at the Mount of Olives. So I'll link this down below. You can go check it out. But I want to show you a picture of the Mount of Olives, which is probably what Jesus was seeing at the time when he delivered the Olivet Discourse. So this is a picture of the Mount of Olives. The picture is taken from the Mount of Olives, and it's looking down on Jerusalem. This picture is also linked below in the description, so you can go and check it out. But this basically is Jerusalem. This little building here with the little gold top, that is where the Jewish temple used to be before it was destroyed in 70 AD. So when the Olivet Discourse begins in Mark 13, Luke 24, or Luke 21, and Matthew 24, it says that Jesus was in Jerusalem. He was at the temple, and then he left the temple, and his disciples said, "Oh, look at these great buildings." This is where they were. They were around this area, this building, and somehow or way they left the city and they ended up here. Now this is a cemetery now. This is a current picture. I think this is 2009. There's a cemetery up here. It's a Jewish cemetery. Jesus is not buried here, by the way. But this this is a Jewish cemetery. And this is probably the view, or at least close enough to the view, of what Jesus had when he delivered the Olivet Discourse. In other words, Jesus was looking right down at the temple when he gave the Olivet Discourse. And so now here we are today, about 2,000 years later, and we get to look from the same ridge, from the same mountaintop, look down at the city of Jerusalem and read the Olivet Discourse. How incredible is that? Let's go read the Olivet Discourse. So here we are in the Olivet Discourse, Mark chapter 13. And the reason why I showed you the map first, and then the picture, the Mount of Olives, to simply show you what it looks like in real life so you can understand what it means when you read the text. So let's go ahead and read what it says. Verse 1, as Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones! What magnificent buildings! Do you see all these great buildings?" Replied Jesus, "Not one stone here will be left upon another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, opposite of the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to be fulfilled?" So, one of the most important things that you need to understand about the Olivet Discourse has absolutely nothing to do with prophecy, Jesus' second coming, the rapture, preterism, partial preterism, futurism, postmillennialism, premillennialism, any of that stuff. None of that stuff matters. Literally, none of that stuff matters at all. Not one dime, not one little bit. Here's what matters the most. The distance of time between verses 2 and 3. This is the most important thing that you could possibly understand about Mark chapter 13, Matthew 24, and Luke 21, because they all have it. Jesus was in Jerusalem, and while he was in Jerusalem, they asked him a question. One of his disciples asked him a question. They say, "Dude, look at these buildings. Aren't they incredible?" And Jesus says, in Jerusalem, not one stone will be left upon another. Right? Then they walked a mile away to this ridge called the Mount of Olives. They walk out of the city to the Mount of Olives. It could have took them 3 hours to do it. Could have took them an hour to do it. Could have took them 20 minutes. Could have taken them 6 hours. Could have took them all day. Who knows? Who knows how long it took them? But eventually they end up on this ridge. They climbed up this little hill, and they're sitting up there, and they're looking down at Jerusalem, and Jesus begins to speak. And it says, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, opposite of the temple, Peter, James, and John asked him another question. Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to be fulfilled? So what you have to understand is that these questions that the disciples are asking are actually happening in they happen in two entirely different places. One set of questions happens in Jerusalem. Another set of questions happens when they are overlooking the city of Jerusalem. Okay, why is that important? Well, first of all, it's important to understand that there are two different things happening here. Okay, the fact that there are two different locations tells you that there's two different things happening. Secondly, what it also tells you is there is a lot of time that happens in between these verses. In other words, it takes some time to leave Jerusalem and walk up to the Mount of Olives. It takes some time. Maybe it took them 5 minutes, which is time, some time. Maybe it took them 20 minutes, which is some time. If it took them 60 minutes, that's some time. If it took them 3 hours, that's some time. If it took them 6 hours, that's some time. You get the point. It took some time to get up there. And what happened during that some time? What happened in between these verses? When they left Jerusalem and they're walking up to the Mount of Olives, what happened? What did they talk about? What was Jesus thinking about? What were the disciples thinking about? Secondly, what in the world possessed this disciple, whoever it was, to ask the question about these stones? He says, "Oh, hey, look at these great buildings." It's like he's trying to say, "I've never been here before." Well, look, Jesus, and Jesus is acting like he's been there his whole life. Why is that? And why does Jesus have this very strange response of, well, not one stone will be left upon another. It's all going to be destroyed. It's all going to be thrown down. And also understand that the question, Jesus has his own question, right? So the disciples ask a question. And they say, look at these great stones. Or it's like a comment. They say, well, look at these great stones or whatever. And Jesus says, do you see all these great buildings? That's important to understand. Jesus didn't say, you see the temple. No, because they had what? They had left the temple. What happens? It says Jesus was leaving the temple, and after he left, when he was leaving, the disciples said, "What massive buildings! What great stones! Or what great stones! What massive buildings!" And Jesus says, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone's going to be left upon another." So he's not saying, "Look at the temple. The temple is going to be destroyed." He says, "No, the city, these buildings that are surrounding the temple." So when they're in Jerusalem, Jesus gives this prophecy. That is very important to understand. Jesus does not tell his disciples that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed in 70 AD on the Mount of Olives. He does that in Jerusalem. Okay? Then all of a sudden they decide, well, let's take a little walk, guys, and they go up to the Mount of Olives. While they're up on the Mount of Olives, if you understand how important that is, the Mount of Olives itself, it kind of changes your tone about what you think of Mark chapter 13 and Matthew 24 and Luke 21. Whether you're a preterist, partial preterist, or futurist, premillennialist, postmillennialist, whatever you are, it doesn't matter. If you understand what's actually going on here, if you understand what it is that I'm telling you, all of a sudden, lights kind of sort of come on and you go, wait, this makes sense now. Right? And it makes sense because you realize that you were wrong. That's why it makes sense. It's like, I don't know if that's true or not, but it sounded cool. Verse 3 says, Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, opposite of the temple. Peter, James, and John, and Andrew came to him, and they said, tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign? And then Jesus goes on and says, look, here's what's going to happen. So there is a separation here in thought, which means the disciples had time to think about this question. It also means Jesus had time to think about what he had said. How much time? We don't know, but we know that there was some time that happened. And we also know that it is planned. It's planned for Jesus to go to the Mount of Olives and give this speech. In other words, this is not some random thing that randomly happened. Lots of people read this text and they mistakenly think that, but that is not what is happening here. This, my friends, is a very planned thing. So that means one of two things. The gospel writer himself has altered the story and has planned this out, or he's just telling the story as he heard it, and Jesus himself planned this out. Do you understand what I'm trying to tell you? It is significant that Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives. It's so significant that it was purposely planned. This is not a random event. This is not something that just happened. This is not a walk in the park. This is not Jesus' ordinary day. This is something that's premeditated. Jesus thought about this for some time, or at least some human being thought about this for some time. And they said, you know what? This speech needs to happen on the Mount of Olives. So it's either Jesus who did that, or a gospel writer did that, or somebody telling the stories. In other words, somebody knew that the Mount of Olives was very, very important, and they knew that the speech that Jesus gave was very important. Okay, or Jesus said, I have an important speech I need to give, and it needs to happen on the Mount of Olives because it's so significant. That is just incredible. I mean, I'm not really so sure that a lot of people quite understand what I mean by that, but when you study the Mount of Olives and you read this text very closely and you're very careful in how you understand what's happening here, you begin to understand that this is a planned event. Okay, because here's the thing. Why didn't Jesus just stand right there in the temple and say, hey, yeah, you see these great buildings? Yeah, one's not going to be left one another. Oh, and then the disciples say, well, hey, when is this stuff supposed to happen? And Jesus says, well, here's what it gives a speech right there in the temple, right in the courtyard. How come it doesn't happen then? Well, because they need this speech, whoever it is, whether it's Jesus or a gospel writer, they need this speech to happen on the Mount of Olives. It needs, because it doesn't make sense. It needs to be on this ridge that's overlooking the city. That the speech is designed to be there. Now, if you want to call that divine providence, good for you. If you want to call that human in entanglement, the human author got involved and changed the story, that's fine too. I don't really care which way you want to go. That's not for me to say or decide or whatever. I'm just telling you that those are two possibilities. Actually, I'm really just kind of using them as an example to really emphasize the point of how significant the Mount of Olives is. It's so significant that Jesus' speech is planned to be there. Now, I don't know who planned for it to be there, and I don't think anybody knows who planned for it to be there. Because even if God himself planned for Jesus to give this speech on the Mount of Olives, how would you know that? How can you prove that? You can't, because we don't have any evidence. In other words, we don't have a little text down here that says, oh, by the way, God planned to do this. We don't have another text that says, oh, by the way, this is a human addition. Somebody adds this story in there. We don't have that. We don't have any way of knowing if those two things happened. I'm just using them as an example to say, to sort of explain how this is a planned event. This is not a random thing that happened. This is planned. The Olivet Discourse was planned to happen on the Mount of Olives. It was planned to happen overlooking the city, not inside the city. Very important to understand that. It's very, very, very important that you understand the difference between the time and distance in between verses 2 and 3. You have to understand that Jesus said in Jerusalem, the city's going to be destroyed. And then when he's up on the Mount of Olives, he explains to you how it's going to be destroyed. Let me say that again. While Jesus is in Jerusalem, he tells his disciples that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. Then he leaves the city and he's up on the Mount of Olives. He's up on this ridge looking down at the city. And then he explains how it's supposed to happen. That, my friends, is a planned event. That is not chance. That's not random. Somebody wanted that to happen. Who that was, I don't know, but this is planned. This is premeditated stuff. Very important for you to understand. If you like this video and want to know more, you can hit the subscribe button for more videos. If you have a question or a comment, or maybe you just like to say something or express your opinion, go ahead and comment that below. And like the video if you like the video, because liking the video is always a good thing when you like the video. My name is Adam Jordan Clark, and you can find out more about me if you like at my website, adamjordanclark.com. And as always, I will see you in the next video.